Nancy Orberg tells the story of her experience in an emergency room as a nurse. She says she was working in a busy emergency room, and a regular visitor, Billy, who was a cute 2-year-old with freckles and blonde hair, came in once again. Billy had been coming in for over a year, and every time he came in, the doctors diagnosed him with asthma. But the source of the illness was a mystery to the medical staff because Billy had not had asthma as an infant. There wasn't a family history of asthma. There weren't any obvious signs of allergies that would cause the asthma, but the symptoms were all asthmatic. Sometimes Billy was treated and sent home. Other times he even ended up in ICU because his breathing was so labored. This continued for about a year. Staff grew fond of Billy. He came in one day with breathing difficulties, and one of the medical interns decided, kind of on a lark, to look up Billy's nose. And she found a black jelly bean. Billy's brother had put it there a year before. What came out with the jelly bean was not pretty. She says, "We had treated Billy for the wrong condition for almost a year. In light of the circumstances, I put signs on the wall of the emergency room that said, 'Look for jelly beans.'" You see, when you're working in the ER, properly diagnosing a problem can be the difference between life and death, and it's not always easy. You see, doctors don't always know the right answer. Their job is complicated, and it can be a challenge. In the same way, being a king is not an easy job. And we're going to see this morning as we come back to our young King Solomon. And in today's story, Solomon feels the weight of the world on his shoulders, the weight of the kingdom on his shoulders. And during this night encounter with God, Solomon is going to have a chance like no other. Now, before we dive into today's text, I want to just say we had a great trip to Camp Barnabas last week. If you don't know what Camp Barnabas is, it's a camp in Missouri where our teens go and serve as missionaries, partnering with a disabled teen for a week and helping that teenager have a camp experience. It was a wonderful week, and we just want to say thank you to everyone for their support. The teens will be sharing at a later point on some level about their experience there. Most of you, or many of you, have looked at pictures this week, and your responses on Facebook have been very encouraging. I also like to thank Neil Kring last week for preaching. If you were here last week, we gathered, not we, but you all gathered in this room with 2 other churches, the Revolution Church and the Bridge Church and First Baptist, all gathered on this holiday weekend, and from what I understand, had a great experience. I wish I could have been here for that, but I'm glad that everything went well there. But this morning, we come back to our study on the life of Solomon. It's been a fun study for me so far as we've been preparing each week. We've walked through Solomon's coronation, through his early days on the throne, and the last time I was with you was on June the 28th, and we talked about these summary verses at the very beginning of 1 Kings chapter 3. They kind of give us an indication of what's going to be happening over Solomon's life. But today we move on in the latter part of chapter 3, and we're going to talk about Solomon's wisdom that was given to him by God. Next week, we're going to explore a story where Solomon puts his wisdom to use. If you kind of look at this, and if you kind of want to know kind of a bird's eye view, in July, we're going to be talking about Solomon's wisdom. All the text, and we're kind of taking these in order, are going to be talking about his wisdom. In August, we're going to talk about the temple. That's another major thing that Solomon does, is build the temple. And it just so happens that all of our weeks in August have to do with the temple. So it kind of gives you an idea of where we're going there. But let me invite you this morning to find a Bible. And it will be helpful for you to have the text in front of you. So if you didn't bring one this morning, you should be able to find one in the pew in front of you. And turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 3. And this morning we're going to be looking at verses 4 through 15. Now, just a note here, this story is also recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 2. We're primarily going to be looking at the 1 Kings passage this morning, but I'll reference the 2 Chronicles passage, and when I do, I'll put that verse on the screen for you. But the 1 Kings verses will not all be on the screen, so you want to have that Bible open in front of you. We're not going to have a reader this morning. I'm just going to read the text as we go along this morning. 1 Kings chapter 3, beginning in verse 4. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Now, we've been talking about high places. You remember that, again, there's no temple yet. The temple is not built. There's these high places that are set up around the country. We talked about the really places of worship. And sometimes people would go and sacrifice to pagan gods on the high places. So in many ways you might say, well, a high place is a bad place, right? But it's not always a bad place. It's just a neutral place. And sometimes people go and worship to Yahweh, worship God. And that's what Solomon is doing here. And he goes to this high place called Gibeon. Now, if you flip over to the 2 Chronicles passage, we read this, and it gives us a little bit more information about why Gibeon was important. Gibeon, for God's tent of meeting was there, which Moses, the Lord's servant, had made in the wilderness. So that's why it's an important place. That's why Solomon goes there. It's a short distance from Jerusalem, and Solomon goes there to sacrifice. Now, you might remember as we studied David last year, David's first act as king was to go and get the ark, right? A symbol of worship. And he stood before the ark and he worshiped the Lord. In the same way, Solomon is going to worship. He's going to call on God for help and provision as he steps into his role as king. David told his son, but he needed to seek God. We read back in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, David said to Solomon, now devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. So that's what Solomon's doing. He's going to worship. But notice, he is extravagant in his worship. He doesn't just offer a sacrifice. He doesn't just offer a couple of sacrifices. He offers how many? 1,000 sacrifices. Solomon is serious about seeking God, and he's worshiping God. The next verse propels us into this familiar story. Look at verse 5 with me. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. Now, if you're looking at the 2 Chronicles passage side by side here, the 2 Chronicles passage says, that night God appeared to Solomon and said to him. So we've got this idea of God appearing in the 2 Chronicles passage, and here in the 1 Kings passage, it indicates that it's a dream that's going on here. Now, I'll say this a little bit later on, but the word for dream here really just means revelation from God. So whether he's asleep or he's awake, we're not sure, but it is a revelation from God. And look at what God says to him in verse 5 here. God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. I mean, God's like a genie in a bottle here, isn't he? And this is kind of strange. It's a rare thing that's going on. Most of the time, God's not asking, God's telling, right? And we are invited to join God on his mission, but here God is asking. Now, I remember when I was a kid, I used to dream about finding a bottle genie, right? Did you ever hope you could find one? And if you found one, I had it all worked out. I was going to ask for something, whatever it was that I wanted as a kid first. And then number 2, I was going to ask for something else. And then number 3, I was going to say, and I want 2 more wishes, right? And then I'd go back again and start over. And I had just this endless list of things that I would ask if if a genie gave me the chance to get whatever I wanted. What would you ask for? If God said to you, whatever you want, you can have it. What would your answer be? You have to wonder if God knows Solomon's heart, right? And he knows what Solomon's going to ask for before he gives him the chance. But no doubt we can learn much from this story. Let's keep going here. Look at Solomon's initial response. Solomon's initial response is a response of gratitude. Look at what he says in verse 6. Solomon answered, you've shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, isn't it interesting how Solomon responds? God says, whatever you want, just let me know and I'll give it to you. Solomon doesn't rub his hands together and say, well, let's see, what could I ask for? Solomon responds with a heart of gratitude. Solomon wonders why God would ask him a question like this. He considers all that God has done for him, and he allows this to form the context for the conversation that he's about to have with God. Now, think about our prayers. How often when we pray do we ask God for something. Ask God for stuff, right? God, would you do this? God, would you help me pass this test? God, would you allow this to work out this way? God, would you? God, would you? God, would you? And how many times do we say, God, thank you. God, praise you. God, you've given me so much. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't ask for stuff. Certainly Jesus tells us to ask, right? But maybe we learn from this text this morning that it's an appropriate thing to do. Before we ask God, we should thank God. Before we say, God, would you give me? Maybe we should say, God, praise you because you have already given me. And then whatever we want to say there. It's appropriate to ask God, but it's also appropriate, I think, first of all, to thank God for what He has given us. So Solomon has this posture of gratitude. Notice also that he has a posture of humility here as he approaches God. Now, Solomon's not going to be perfect. We read the last time we were together about the fact that Solomon is going to have many failures in his life. But right here, he gets it right. Look what it says in verse 7. Now, Lord my God, you've made your servant king in place of my father David. Again, gratitude. But then look at what he says. But I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Solomon is not only thankful, but Solomon is humble. He sees himself as a little child. He sees himself as not knowing how to carry out his duties. You see, being a king would be pretty cool, right? I mean, can you imagine being anointed as king? Being brought into the city and everyone is seeing you as king. But with the wonderful experience of being king comes the responsibility of being king, right? And maybe Solomon is beginning to feel that responsibility. We saw in the first 2 chapters, David was still alive, right? And David is giving Solomon instructions. David gave Solomon pretty specific instructions about what he's supposed to do. Hey, this dude over here, you want to take him out. Remember that? This guy over here, you want to watch him. You want to do this, you want to do that. And maybe so far, Solomon's kind of been working through the list that David has given him. And maybe, just maybe, Solomon's at the end of his list. He's done everything that David told him to do. And he's like, what am I supposed to do next? How am I supposed to be king? What if someone comes in and asks me something and I don't know the answer? You see, the weight of being king is laying heavy on Solomon. And Solomon is humbled by that fact. And Solomon looks to God and he says, look, I'm just a little child. I don't quite know what to do here. It's worth noting here that this is kind of a different side of Solomon that we're seeing. I think here Solomon looks a lot like his dad, doesn't he? He looks a lot like David here. His heart is in the right place. His heart is humble before God. His heart is a heart of gratitude before God. Solomon wrote in Proverbs, he mocks the proud mockers, but shows favor to the humble and oppressed. Solomon knows what it means to be humble. He knows how God responds. Just a note here, both James and Peter will quote this verse in the New Testament. Solomon understands that he needs God. And in many ways, this is where we all need to start, isn't it? I don't know about you, but have you ever confessed to God, God, I need you. God, I can't do this on my own. God, and maybe it's about a job. Maybe it's about a test you're taking. Maybe it's about a certain life circumstance and you just come before God and say, I can't do this on my own. I need you, God. Maybe it's about the sin problem that you and I all have, right? And we understand we sin. We fall short of God's glory. We fall short of Him. And we have the good news this morning that God has solved that for us, right? He came and He humbled Himself on a cross. He paid the price for your sin, for my sin on the cross. And the first step is to say, I need you, God. I need you. I cannot do this on our own. Maybe you've tried, you know that. And you've come back to God and you say, God, I can't do this without you. Solomon says, I need you, God. He confesses this. And Solomon then positions his kingship as a calling. Look at this next verse here. Look at verse 8. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. I love Solomon's language here. And do you see what Solomon's doing here? Solomon is diverting the responsibility of being king to God. God, you put me here. God, you've chosen me. I'm just a servant. I'm not a king, I'm a servant. What does he say? He says, I am your servant, God, and you've called me to lead your people. It's appropriate what Solomon is doing here. Again, he is diverting the responsibility to God. What about you? What about me? What about our lives? Do we do this? Are we willing to do this? Are we willing to say to God, God, I'm your child. I'm your servant. Whatever you've called me to, I really can't do this without you. I need you, God. And God, since you've put me here, it's your responsibility to make sure I have what I need. You see, God wants us to do that. You might be going, well, Solomon's kind of like shifting all of it over to God. This is exactly what God wants him to do, right? It's exactly the right thing to do. It's exactly what we should do. Paul writes to the Philippians in Philippians chapter 4, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, do what? Present your request to God. That's where God wants us. And Solomon, again, is modeling for us an appropriate posture before God. You see the difference here? I mean, Solomon could have said, you know what? I'm the king. And you know, God, since you ask, I've got a list here, and I'd really like to have this and this. And, you know, I'd like to have a really cool palace, you know, and maybe, you know, you could work this deal out, and you could work that deal out because I'm the king, God. That's not at all his posture, is it? Solomon says, I'm a child. I'm a servant. I can't do this without you. God, you've done some great things for me already, but you need to know I can't go on unless you give me what I need to go on. And maybe this morning that's exactly what you need to do. Maybe in your own life, and I'm not sure where you are this morning, but maybe in your life you've got kind of this posture that says, you know what, I can do this on my own. And, you know, I kind of need God on the side. What's the old bumper sticker? God is my co-pilot, right? He's sitting beside me. He's kind of, you know, helping me out when I need to be helped out. But I pretty much got this thing on my own. No, it's not at all that. God's not a co-pilot. God is the pilot. And we're just along for the ride. And we're his servant. And we're simply saying to God, God, whatever you want me to do, I'll do. Wherever you want me to go, I'll go. And in fact, I know I can't do it without you. And whatever situation you find yourself in, maybe this morning God would be prompting you, call on me. Confess your need for me. Maybe God would be calling you to give whatever it is that you're dealing with over to him today. So, we still haven't gotten to the question, have we? What's Solomon going to ask for? God has given him this incredible opportunity to choose anything. Solomon so far has responded by thanking God and by understanding his own inadequacies. But here in verse 9, Solomon asks, look what he asked for. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? Now, if you look at the Hebrew word that is translated discerning in the NIV, it's the word sama, and it means to listen or to hear and obey. I love this word. To discern has to do with hearing God's voice and then following it. Solomon wants a heart that hears God and follows God. He wants a heart that relies on God for leadership. What a beautiful thing, isn't it? To say, God, I just want to understand you and hear you and obey you. That's all I want, God. You ask me for whatever I want, I'm telling you, that's what I want. And you know, we translate that as wisdom. That is true wisdom, isn't it? But I love the word, a discerning heart. Solomon says, I want my heart to be your heart, God. I want to do what you want me to do. When a situation comes and I have to administer that as king, I just want to be able to hear your voice. I want you to tell me what to do, and I want to be able to do it. That's what I want, God. Notice his language here. He calls himself, again, a servant. And he says, I want to be able to serve this great people of yours. It's yours, God. It's not mine. You know, you can call me the king, Solomon says, but it's not me. It's you. And these people here, they're your people, God. And if you've called me to be king, I want to be able to hear your voice and to follow you. I want to know how to govern. I want to know what the right way and the wrong way is. I am totally capable of messing this deal up, Solomon says. I need you, God, to lead me in this. He knows that he needs God, and he asks God for a listening heart. That's really what he's asking for. Solomon has an appropriate view of the situation, doesn't he? And you and I can learn much from this. How about us? Do we even want a discerning heart? Most of us, that hasn't even entered our mind, has it? We think, oh, I got this. But God says, our Solomon says, I need a discerning heart. I can't do this on my own. You and I need a discerning heart, don't we? We need to hear God's voice, and we need to learn what it means to follow him. So, how did God like Solomon's answer? Look what he says in verse 10. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. Right answer, right? Literally reads in Hebrew, it was good in God's eyes. That's what it says. God responds to Solomon in verse 11. So God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for a long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. Now, if God showed up and said you can have whatever you want, what would a lot of people ask for, right? Money. A long life, right? Death of their enemies. Would you ask for that? Maybe this person you don't like very much, you don't want them to succeed. Maybe you'd ask for them to kind of not have it so great. I'm not sure. But that's what a lot of people ask for. And God says, that's what many people would have asked for, but you've not asked for that. You have asked for discernment. And God says, look, I'm going to give it to you. And I'm going to give it to you in a way like no one else has ever had it. Now you have to wonder, is this a trick question here? If Solomon would have asked for something, selfish, would God have given it to him? I think God would have, but here God is affirming this answer. Verse 12, I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Solomon, you're going to be so wise. No one has ever been as wise as you. And no one will ever be as wise as you. We still refer to Solomon, don't we, as the wisest man who ever lived. That's what the text tells us there. But there's more. Let's keep reading. Moreover, verse 13, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. Solomon's going to get not only what he asked for, but he's going to get what he did not ask for. Why? Maybe God thought he could handle it, right? Maybe God knew that his heart was in the right place. Now, I want to be very careful here. Some people take stories like Solomon and they develop kind of a prosperity gospel. Kind of goes like this. If you love God, if you're following God, then your bank account will show it, right? And if you don't love God and you're struggling spiritually, then you're not going to have a lot of stuff. And there couldn't be anything further from the truth this morning. Let me tell you, there's some people who are walking with God, and God calls them to live a life of suffering and even a life of poverty. And there's some people who are very evil, right? And they have lots of material blessings. So I don't think you can go there. But in this story, here, God gives Solomon wealth and honor, and we can say he does this because of Solomon's heart. And I guess we can say God sometimes does this, right? Not all the time. Just because somebody's wealthy doesn't mean that they're tight with God. Just because somebody's poor, it doesn't mean that they're far from God. But here in this case, in this text, God gives Solomon wealth and honor. And I believe because he thinks that Solomon can handle it. Finally, one more promise here. Notice this one comes with a condition. Verse 14, and if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Now, you might notice here that long life has a condition, doesn't it? And that condition is obedience. It sounds a lot like Deuteronomy chapter 5, right? Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you. That's one of the 10 Commandments, right? So that you may, what? Live long and that it may go well with you in the land your God has given you. We see often, especially in the Old Testament, long life is associated with obedience. And that's the same thing that he tells Solomon there. Wow, what a story, right? What blessing here. I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty stoked if God said all these things to me. The story continues, verse 15. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. Now, the word for dream here, again, the Hebrew word for dream, is understood as a divine revelation. It's not just when you nod off and you go to sleep and you picture something in your mind. In fact, the Hebrew lexicon translates the word dream here, referring to a supernatural revelation by God with words or images. So that's how they understood that in the ancient context. So no doubt this dream, this night vision is understood as a revelation from God. I think that's why 1 Kings says it was a dream, but 2 Chronicles just says he met with God that night. And that's what's going on here. Our story closes today with Solomon coming back home in verse 15. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. What does he do? He comes back home. He goes before the ark. It's worth noting here that David stands before the ark. Solomon stands before the ark. But there'll be a time when only the priest can stand before the ark. What does he do? He goes in and he worships God. He's thanking God. His heart is full of gratitude still for this encounter with God. And then what does he do after he worships? He throws a feast. Now, a feast is a party, okay? And so Solomon says, look, we have a lot to celebrate here. Let's all celebrate. He's looking forward to all that God is going to do through him. So as we close this morning, we want to ask ourselves a question. That's a great story, right? We learned from that story. But what does it have to do with us today? What does it have to do with me in 2015? First of all, I think the story teaches us the appropriate posture before God, doesn't it? Humility and gratitude. Now again, Solomon's not perfect, is he? He's going to mess up. Sometimes he's going to do some things that are not in line with God's will. But at this place and time, this picture, this snapshot of Solomon, we have a picture of what it means to be appropriately humble before God, to be appropriately dependent on God. And this morning, as we read this story, we have to ask ourselves the same question: are we in this place before God? If God showed up and said, what do you want? I'll give you anything. Would we rub our hands together and think of what we've been wanting? Or would we say to God like Solomon said, God, I just want to hear you. I want to hear your voice. I want to obey you in everything that I do. Secondly, this morning, I think the theme of provision is in this text this morning. And again, it raises several questions for us, doesn't it? Does God provide wealth and honor to those who follow him? And you know, it's a tricky question, isn't it? Because we can easily kind of gravitate toward this prosperity gospel here. But what I think we need to learn from this text is, yes, God does provide. And again, without going too far into this, I think God gives Solomon wealth and honor. At the same time, God knows Solomon's heart. Now again, we could probably build a case as we go on here that wealth and honor may not have been the best thing for Solomon at times. I mean, he's gonna go into some places and do some things that don't honor God. Wealth is always a dangerous thing. We're going to see that later on. But here at this point in time, God provides for his child. And I think he provides for his child because his child is saying, I need you, God. I need you, God. This morning, maybe you're suffering. Maybe you don't have what you think you need. You can learn from this story that God will provide for you. And when we give God what we need to give God, he'll take care of the rest. And I think we see that going on here in the text. Solomon says to God, I just want a discerning heart. God gives him the things that he did not ask for, but his heart was in the appropriate place to begin with. Let me close this morning by just posing the question. What if God offered you one wish this morning? What if God said to you, you just name it, it's yours. What would you ask for? How would you respond? And as you think about that this morning, as you're really honest with yourself this morning, I mean, we all know the right answer, right? Now. It's kind of like when you're in Sunday school and the teacher asks a question, the little kids just say, Jesus, right? Because Jesus is always the right answer. We know the right answer now, but I want you to really be honest with yourself this morning. I want you to really consider, what would you ask for? And you might be saying to yourself this morning, you know what? I wouldn't be like Solomon. I would ask for A or B or C, whatever's on my list. And as you do that this morning, allow that to be a way in which you examine your heart. Allow that to be a way that you say, you know what? I don't really get that I need God. I don't really get that I can't do this on my own. And God, I need to know. I need you to reveal to me that I need you. Maybe, again, it's in a particular instance in your life. Maybe it's at the whole deal with that you got a sin problem. And you need God. You got a sin problem that you can't take care of on your own. And you need Jesus' shed blood on the cross to cover it over this morning. And maybe this morning God would simply say, you would simply say to God, I need you. Maybe this morning as you answer that question, God would be saying to you, you know what, you're not really thankful for what I've given you. I've given you this and this and this. And you haven't said thank you one time. Maybe this morning your heart would change just a little bit in terms of asking God for stuff toward praising God for what He has given you. Maybe God would be speaking to you in that way. I'm not sure what God is saying to you this morning, but we're going to take a minute this morning and respond. And I just want you to respond in whatever way God is prompting you. If you feel like you need to come and pray, the altar is open. Maybe God's speaking to you in some way. You just need to come and talk to Him this morning. Maybe God has revealed to you that you have a sin problem and that you need His shed blood on the cross. And you need to come and confess that this morning. I'll be standing down front. Maybe this morning you've been a part of this church for some time and you're thinking, I just need to join this church or I need to be baptized. And there's some other decision that you need to make this morning. You come as we stand and sing together. Let's all stand and sing.